The chipped formica of the counter felt cold beneath Elias Thorne's hand as he observed the blue spoon, the diner he'd built from the ground up 15 years ago. The sizzle of the grill, the clatter of plates, the low hum of conversation, a familiar symphony he hadn't conducted in far too long, lost amidst corporate calls and expansion strategies. Today, Elias wore a worn chambray shirt, a faded baseball cap, and a few days' growth of beard, another anonymous face in his own bustling establishment. At 48, he no longer needed to wipe tables or man the fryer. Yet a persistent unease, a discordant note in the otherwise harmonious financial reports, had pulled him back. This particular blue spoon in the quiet town of Havenwood showed steady profits, a loyal customer base, but an inexplicably high staff turnover and a subtle shift in the regulars' demeanor. Something felt wrong. Elias chose a seat at the counter, a silent observer. A young woman with bright pink hair, her name tag reading Skylar, approached, her gaze distant. "What can I get for you?" she asked, her tone perfunctory. "Black coffee," Elias replied, his voice roughened, "and a stack of her blueberry pancakes." He then leaned in slightly. "That gentleman working the dish pit. Been here long?" Skylar's lips curled slightly. Her eyes flickered towards the back where a tall, thin black man with salt and pepper hair meticulously washed dishes, his movements economical despite his age. "Old man Samuel? Feels like he's been here forever. Probably before I was born. They just keep him around. You know how some folks are loyal to a fault." She gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. Elias offered no reaction, his gaze fixed on Samuel Jones. There was a quiet dignity in the way he worked, each plate handled with a care that seemed out of place in the hurried environment. A muffled laugh drifted from the other end of the counter. Elias subtly turned to see a wiry young man with gelled-back hair, Bryce, whispering something to Skylar, their shared amusement directed towards Samuel. Elias sipped his coffee, the bitterness lingering. He had returned at the right time. Spreadsheets wouldn't reveal the true illness afflicting the blue spoon. He needed to witness it. And what he saw first was a quiet resilience in Samuel's eyes, a steadiness that seemed to have weathered more than just years of dishwater. His gaze remained on Samuel, a man who should have been enjoying his golden years, not toiling in the steam and noise of a busy kitchen. Samuel was almost invisible, a fixture in the background, yet he was always the one who quietly cleaned up spills or offered a polite nod to the customers. He never complained about the heavy lifting or the late hours. He simply worked. Elias watched as a young couple argued over a small discrepancy in their bill. Without fanfare, Samuel reached into his worn apron pocket and placed a few dollars on their table, then returned to his work. "Always trying to be the hero," Bryce muttered, loud enough for Elias to hear. Skylar giggled, probably just trying to get a bigger tip. A knot formed in Elias's stomach. Samuel, seemingly oblivious, continued his tasks. When a child dropped a handful of crayons, it was Samuel who gently helped pick them up, offering a kind smile. When an elderly woman fumbled with her change, Samuel was the one who quietly added a few coins to her hand. "He's different," Skylar whispered to Bryce, a hint of something unreadable in her tone. Elias's grip tightened on his mug. These were his employees, this was his diner, and the culture he had strived to build seemed to be fraying. Under his own roof, a man who carried himself with quiet grace was being subtly demeaned. Samuel paused, briefly touching his lower back, a small gesture that hinted at unseen aches. Elias exhaled slowly. He had returned at the right moment, but the question was no longer just about the business. It was about the people within it. The afternoon unfolded with a deceptive normalcy. Elias remained at the counter, feigning interest in a local paper, his ears picking up the hushed conversations between Bryce and Skylar. "Ms. Jenkins, the manager, is starting to notice the shortages," Skylar murmured, glancing towards the small office. "If the till is short again," Bryce smirked. "Just need old Samuel to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. A dropped bill, a convenient misunderstanding. This time, I'll make sure she sees it," Skylar added, a subtle edge to her voice. "Once he's gone, my cousin needs the hours." Elias could hardly believe the casual cruelty of their plan. It wasn't just about laziness. There was an undercurrent of something else, a subtle dismissal of Samuel that went beyond his age. "Did you see how slow he was with that order?" Bryce scoffed. "Some people just can't keep up." "He's been here too long anyway," Skylar added, her tone dismissive. Elias's knuckles whitened around his mug. The moral compass of his staff seemed dangerously skewed. Later, Elias saw Skylar discreetly tuck a few bills into her pocket after a cash transaction. She then approached Ms. Jenkins. "Ms. Jenkins, the register's short again. $30. I just counted. $30? Again." Ms. Jenkins's brow furrowed. "Bryce, did you notice anything?" Bryce shook his head, his eyes shifting towards Samuel, who was quietly sweeping near the entrance. A flicker of something, suspicion, prejudice, crossed Ms. Jenkins's face before she sighed. Elias watched, a cold resolve hardening within him. He knew that if he didn't intervene, an injustice would occur, fueled by greed and perhaps something more insidious. And Elias knew he couldn't stand by and let that happen. That evening, Elias went directly to the corporate office. He reactivated the dormant surveillance system for the Havenwood location and made a personal request for immediate access to the live feeds. He needed to see everything, to hear everything with his own eyes. The next day, Elias was back at the Blue Spoon before dawn. He installed a small, inconspicuous recording device near the register during a moment when the diner was empty. He then settled at his usual counter spot, the silent observer once more. Over the next 2 days, the surveillance footage painted a clear picture. Bryce was consistently underringing orders and pocketing the difference. Skylar was deliberately miscounting change and blaming discrepancies on clerical errors. And both of them consistently made subtle, demeaning remarks about Samuel, his age, his work ethic, and quiet insinuations that played on unspoken biases. Point 1, recording showed Bryce mimicking Samuel's movements behind his back, snickering with Skylar. Another captured Skylar rolling her eyes and muttering about Samuel always being in the way. These weren't just the actions of lazy employees. There was a distinct lack of respect, a subtle othering that Elias couldn't ignore. After the late shift on the second day, Elias followed Samuel. The older man drove an aging sedan to a small, modest house on the less affluent side of town. Through the window, Elias saw a warm light and the silhouette of someone waiting for him. The following morning, Elias arrived at the Blue Spoon with Ms. Jenkins in tow. He had shown her snippets of the surveillance footage, enough to pique her concern without revealing the full extent of Bryce and Skylar's actions. As the morning rush began, Elias watched as Bryce palmed a $20 bill from the register when Ms. Jenkins was in the back. Moments later, Skylar loudly announced the till was short. Ms. Jenkins's gaze immediately went to Samuel, who was quietly preparing a coffee order. "Samuel," Ms. Jenkins said, her tone neutral but with an underlying edge, "were you near the register recently?" Samuel looked up, his brow furrowed with confusion. "No, ma'am. I've been making coffee." "Bryce said he saw you there," Skylar interjected quickly. Elias stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Ms. Jenkins, if you'll come with me, I think I have something that might clarify things." He led her to a back room where he had set up a monitor displaying the live surveillance feed. As Ms. Jenkins watched the footage of Bryce's blatant theft and Skylar's complicity, her face paled. Then came the clips of their demeaning comments about Samuel, the subtle jabs that hinted at a deeper disrespect. Ms. Jenkins's eyes narrowed. This is unacceptable." Elias nodded. Indeed. Moments later, Ms. Jenkins confronted Bryce and Skylar with the evidence. They initially denied everything, but the unblinking eye of the camera told a different story. When confronted with their cruel remarks about Samuel, a tense silence filled the room. "What?" Ms. Jenkins asked, her voice low with disappointment. Bryce mumbled something about Samuel being slow and not fitting in. Skylar remained silent, her gaze fixed on the floor. Elias stepped forward. "Ms. Jenkins, I think it's clear what's been happening here. Not only theft, but a pattern of disrespect towards a valued employee." The situation was handled swiftly. Bryce and Skylar were terminated immediately. Ms. Jenkins, visibly shaken, apologized to Samuel, her words carrying a weight of belated recognition. Later that day, Elias approached Samuel, who was quietly cleaning his station. "Samuel," he said, his voice sincere, "I saw what happened. I heard what they said, and I want you to know that it was wrong. You are a valued member of this team." Samuel looked up, his eyes holding a quiet dignity. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne. I just tried to do my job." Elias nodded. "Well, Samuel, I think it's time your hard work and your character were recognized." The changes at the Blue Spoon were immediate. A new atmosphere of respect began to take root. Elias made it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated. He also quietly increased Samuel's responsibilities and his pay, acknowledging his years of quiet dedication. While the story doesn't explicitly delve into overt acts of racial discrimination, the subtle hints in Bryce and Skylar's dismissive attitudes and vague justifications leave room for the interpretation that Samuel's race might have played a role in their lack of respect, adding a layer of complexity to the injustice he faced. The focus, however, remains on the triumph of kindness and integrity over prejudice and greed.